When critics of immigration talk about why they want to restrict immigration, at the top of the list is usually the idea that immigrants are a drain on resources, that they don't pay enough in tax, and that they take benefits that should be going to American citizens. But is that true? David Bier is the Director of Immigration Studies at Cato, and he's the author of a new report on the fiscal contributions of immigrants to the United States. Somewhat counterintuitively, he finds that virtually every kind of immigrant, low skill and high skill, legal and illegal, are fiscal net contributors to the U.S. And he joins the podcast to talk about why. Why is it that immigrants contribute more in taxes than they do take in benefits? Why do people believe the opposite? And how does this break down by different categories of immigrants? And what does it mean for the U.S. fiscal debt picture in the long run? As always, thank you for listening to the podcast. We're always happy when anyone can share with a friend, like, subscribe. And if you really want to support the podcast, please do so by becoming a member of the Center for New Liberalism. You can do that at cnliberalism.org. Thank you for listening one more time, and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me this episode is David Bier. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
All right, so you've written a new report on the fiscal impact of immigrants, and the headline here is that, I think, contrary to a lot of people's expectations, that immigrants are fiscal contributors to the United States. That is to say that they contribute more than they actually take out of the system. And this, I think, at least in the popular discourse, is contrary to a lot of people's expectations. There's this kind of narrative that, like, immigrants are taking out of the system, right? They are using our services. They are people who are draining, our services, welfare, housing, they're using the school systems. They're doing all this stuff. And you certainly hear that from people on the right who are opposed to immigration, from immigration skeptics. Sometimes you kind of even hear this from the left, where people might be pro-immigration, but it's almost viewed as a form of like a charity. Like, this is something we owe to the world because we are rich and we must do this to help them.
Yeah.
Very few people actually seem to be making the case that, well, like, no, immigrants are just good for us. They help us.
Yeah.
So can you break that down? Like, why, from a 10,000 level view, why is it the case that these people's intuitions are all wrong?
Yeah. I mean, people's intuitions do start with a true premise that the government spends way more than it takes in taxes every year. So we have a huge deficit and our debt is growing. And this is a serious problem, in my opinion, and basically everyone else who's looked at this question. Yeah, this is a serious problem. But when you look at the debt and the deficit and look at all the spending that goes out, you can really divide the spending into two parts. Part of it is spent on things that, the needs of people. As the population grows, we need to spend more on basically all of the things that you normally think of. Healthcare spending goes up, Social Security spending goes up, all of the benefits that are provided to the population increases as the population grows. Then you have an education. We would even throw in parks and roads and other things like that, policing, all that stuff we need to expand as the population grows. Then you have this huge chunk of spending on the military and interest payments on past debts. And these things don't grow with the population. So an additional person who comes in doesn't increase how much we have to pay on debts that we already accrued. We'd have to pay them regardless of whether the immigrant shows up or not. And the same thing for military spending. We're going to have the military. It's going to spend money, and it's going to spend money whether an immigrant comes or doesn't come. And so once you take out all of those expenditures on things that don't grow with the population, you can actually see that the government takes in more in revenue than it spends on all the stuff that we would consider benefits that are provided to the population.
So essentially, there's like fixed cost and variable cost for all my accounting majors out there. That
Yeah,
some costs are just they're already baked in. Some
yeah,
costs grow with each additional person, and some
yeah,
costs do
yeah.
not.
So we in the report we call these pure public goods in the sense that they're not something that we're competing over. These are things that are just provided to the population, and it doesn't matter how big the population is.
Well, so how much does that break down though? Like in terms of if we've got the pie chart of all federal spending or all government spending in general, even what percent of that is kind of the fixed versus the variable?
Yeah, no, it's great. So I actually have a chart, a table in there that you can look at and see all of the money that's spent by the government over the last 30 years. And it's almost a third of all government spending is in these categories of pure public goods. And we throw in some other things that are much smaller than the interest payments and military spending that don't grow with the the growth in the population. And so it's about $60 trillion that we spent on the military in real terms and on interest payments on the debt and a few other things that don't grow with the population. So it is an extraordinary sum, and it's the largest component of all government spending is on these two items. So once you pull that out, you reduce the amount of spending that needs to be provided to new individuals on a per capita basis by quite a significant amount. And so then you're looking at, okay, so the average person then is paying more in taxes than they receive in benefits, very broadly defined, all the things that the government spends money on. So then the only question at that point is, are immigrants, higher or below average in terms of their taxes that they pay and the benefits that they receive? And it's a really actually pretty simple calculation on this. If you look at on the tax side, are they paying more in taxes than the average person? If you look at their hourly wage, you think, well, no, because they get paid wages that are on an hourly basis lower than the average person. But what that calculation misses is that they work at much higher rates than the average person. So they work way more hours than the average US born person, almost 12 percentage points more likely to be employed than the average US born person.
Why is it the case that immigrants work so much more often? Because this is something that I think, again, counter to certain people's narratives. Maybe people who are in the game, people who know this kind of stuff are we're not telling them anything new. But again, there's this perception that oh, immigrants come here, and honestly, I think maybe this is like something we've imported from Europe. That like there's a European discourse about immigrants coming and like just joining welfare immediately and not being productive. That I don't know that that's the case as much in the U.S., but people seem worried about that. You're saying they work more often. Do we know why that is?
Well, the biggest single reason is that they show up when they're working age, right? So the average immigrant, they're showing up, they're 25, they're ready to go. They don't have to go to school. They don't have to, you know, um, get educated in order to then start working. They just show up and they're ready to go.
we get their prime working years without having to have the cost of educating them, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's a free worker, and they enter the labor force right away. And so when you look at it, the amount that their share of the workforce much higher than their share of the population. And then right in the middle between their share of the population and their share of the workforce is their share of total income that is produced every year in the United States. And that share of income largely tracks their share of taxes, how much they pay in taxes. And so they end up paying more in taxes than the average person because they work at much higher rates and then earn income at a on a per capita basis higher than the U.S. born population, despite their lower wages. And so there's two elements already that kind of we have a kernel of truth. They pay lower. They're paid lower wages on average, and so your intuition is that they're going to pay fewer taxes, but not because they overall work at much higher rates. And the same thing with our deficit. These are things that you have to look beneath the surface in order to kind of get at the truth of the situation. And then, of course, then you go to the benefit side. So, okay, so they're paying a little bit more in taxes than
Can we hold on to
sure,
benefits for one
yeah,
second? Because that's the two things here, right? Immigrants are fiscally beneficial if, as you said, kind of the taxes they contribute are more than the benefits, and we're leaving completely aside things like cultural value or economic growth or other things, but
yeah,
just on this narrow question, do they contribute more than they take out? You got to count up the tax contributions and you got to count up the benefits they receive. I want to just hold on the benefits, though, even though that is an important part of this,
yeah,
because I think a lot of people will immediately say, well, okay, you're talking about legal immigrants, though. You're talking about immigrants who come through the system and they get a job and they pay taxes. And even in the Republican Party, as anti-immigration as it's become, typically they will say, oh, well, legal immigrants, I don't
yeah,
mind legal immigration, but we have to control illegal immigration. And I think they would be very surprised by your report, which says actually, no, both legal immigrants and illegal immigrants, both high skill and low skill, pretty much every category of immigrant is still fiscally positive. So, can we talk about that? Because a lot of people would be very surprised to learn that, like, illegal immigrants are still fiscally positive. They would be, well, how are they paying taxes?
right.
Aren't they all getting paid under the table? Like, what's the actual mechanism for which, illegal immigrants could possibly be, contributing?
Yeah. Okay. Great questions. So when it comes to the income tax, many illegal immigrants do get paid on the books and uh, uh, under assumed identities, or in some cases, they might get work authorization while they have an application pending for asylum or other things, right? So, or they could even be included, actually have legal status, but it's temporary and it's going to expire. The temporary protected status program, for example, would actually be included in our numbers of illegal immigrants because they're temporarily allowed to stay, but uh, they don't, otherwise they're treated as people who wouldn't have legal status. And under this administration, they've taken away those temporary statuses. So in any case, the bucket of illegal immigrants and who's considered that is a matter of debate. But we generally use the same mechanism of identification as the Pew Research Center and even the anti-immigrant people would kind of use the same methodologies on this. So you have some people, they have legal status or they're borrowing identities or whatever the case might be. And about 60% of them, based on tax records, either file taxes voluntarily using what's known as an ITIN number, which the IRS provides to encourage tax compliance among the illegal immigrant population, or they have their wages withheld by their employer, based on an assumed identity or whatever the case might be. So once you look at that and then you compare that number to what's the average person's tax compliance, you end up with they're about 67% of the average is the what the evidence would indicate. And a lot of that is the fact that it's actually easier now to work on the table rather than under the table, or over the table rather than under the table. I don't know if that's the right expression or not, but that's the assumptions that kind of go into assessing the income and Social Security, FICA taxes that employers pay and workers pay through the payroll withholding process. So that's a good chunk. And then, so obviously they're paying much less than a legal worker on those two tax items. On the other hand, they also pay property taxes, both directly and indirectly through property ownership, but also as a renter, their landlord is paying taxes on their behalf, uh, uh, which is passed on to them in terms of higher rents. The corporate income tax also, the profits being generated by the immigrants are then generating tax revenue through the corporate income tax. And of course, the sales tax is the other major one, which, it's unavoidable to pay that tax through their purchases and consumption. So those are the main tax mechanisms that they're contributing to higher taxation or tax revenue rather. And so on the tax side, they do pay less than the average legal worker. But then, of course, the benefits side of things is where the real savings come in, because they're subject to much more severe restrictions on eligibility for benefits.
So basically, we've got these different groups of workers, and probably, if people aren't that surprised that legal immigrants who work at very high rates, who are mostly prime age, biased towards being prime age and biased towards being men, I think, they are going to be contributing a lot because so many of them are just in the workforce. But even with illegal immigrants, just because enough of them, are kind of in the system somehow to pay, payroll taxes, and then they're paying the other kinds of taxes,
Yeah.
that balances out.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it balances out. It's not like they're the same. And of course, the wage earnings for illegal immigrants are much, much, much lower than they are for the average legal immigrant because of the education and the types of jobs that they're working in. So it's not as if an illegal immigrant is as positive as a legal immigrant once you control for uh, uh, but once you control for their educational attainment, they actually are pretty similar. But just the average illegal immigrant is just much more lower skilled and occupying jobs that are
Mhm.
much less uh, have much lower earnings. Yeah.
So then let's talk about the benefits side now. Because again, this is the classic fear of the anti-immigration warrior, is that people are going to come to America and they're going to take advantage of our rich and generous social welfare system,
Yeah.
to, live the easy life compared to where they came from. But I guess from a factual basis, how true is that? How eligible are immigrants? I guess this depends on various statuses, of course, but in general, can you give like a summary of like, are immigrants even eligible for the big welfare programs in America? Most of our social spending is either Social Security or the big healthcare programs. Like those two are probably the majority of what we do. So when we talk about those, like how many immigrants are even getting anything out of that system? And then if they are, how does that compare to what they pay in?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at the all spending, you can break it down into, we break it down into five buckets. And the old age benefits, retiree benefits are by far the largest component of spending after those public goods I already talked about, the military and the interest payments. So the next largest chunk is for retiree benefits, Medicare, Social Security, and public pensions, which is often forgot about, but is really a very significant component of spending as well. And so if you look at that, I mean, the illegal immigrants are not eligible for any of those. Um, at the state level, they might be eligible um, for public pensions if they had worked for the government, but I mean, even at the state level, usually they have citizenship or status requirements, and so immigrants work for governments at all levels at about half the rate that their share of the population would predict. So they're much less likely to receive these public pensions. Illegal immigrants not eligible at all for Social Security or Medicare, and so they receive those at or immigrants as a population end up costing in terms of old age benefits about I can give you the exact number here in a second, about 34% less, so a third less than the average person in the United States. So that is a huge saving. That's the biggest saving on on the spending side comes from less spending on retiree benefits. And on the
That is interesting because that's not something I think people think about very often. It is government pensions. I mean, it's just not. I don't know. I maybe I don't know enough federal workers. Maybe I need to move down to DC and be part of that, ecosystem. But I think about, just are they getting Social Security? Are they getting Medicare? Would be the big things.
Yeah, those are the big things at the federal level. Public pensions at the state level are a much bigger deal.
Mm,
Of
yeah,
course, at the even at the federal level, I mean, it's a good chunk of money. It's just not in the context of
fair,
all the
fair.
other things the federal government spends money on.
And the state versus federal argument is something that I hear sometimes because look, listeners are not going to be surprised to hear that I am largely sympathetic to your point of view. I'm a very big immigration booster, and I have been for a long time. But one thing that I hear is that, well, you do this calculation at the federal level, sure, but what about the state level where state budgets are getting stressed, education budgets, and the kind of local thing where schools and having to build just the sewer infrastructure for a greater population and like that it's at the state and local level where the communities are really getting stressed. And I hear that. And I think maybe in some cases, especially around the border, there really are like unique stresses for particular cities that have a very high number of immigrants. But so that's one of the rebuttals I hear a lot is that the state and local level is different than the federal level. If you hear that, what's your response?
Look, it's actually much more difficult to avoid paying the state and local taxes directly or indirectly because they're mainly relying on sales tax revenue and property tax revenue. And so the immigrants basically have to pay if they're renters or property owners, they have to pay property tax. That's where most of the money to the states is going, and then the sales taxes. Again, that's the second biggest chunk of state and local revenue. And so between those two mechanisms, you're getting very good tax coverage for any new group that moves in. And if you look at, who's showing up, yes, anytime there's a sudden change in the population, like we saw in 2021, 2022, 2023, yeah, like if there's a sudden unexpected change in the population, there's short-term strain on the infrastructure because it doesn't automatically adjust to the new arrivals. So that's yeah, there's an element of truth to that. In the long term, though, because of the fact that it's very difficult to avoid taxes, and many of these taxes are actually regressive taxes, then the expansion of the population results in more revenue that allows for expansion of services. And if you look at, again, the biggest component of state and local spending that's not federally subsidized is, or not, basically all state and local spending is subsidized to some extent, but the biggest chunk that's is on education. And if you look at immigrants just in isolation, the average immigrant arrives, like I said, around age 25 after they've already been educated. And so, yes, then maybe they have a kid, but that kid's not going to enter the school system who's born here for several years. And so, actually, the biggest component of state and local spending there gets a break on a per capita basis. Yes, there are kids, immigrant kids that, it's not as if they don't exist. Just on a per capita basis, they're about half as likely to be in schools as the average US born person. And so there is less of a burden on a per capita basis from the immigrant population on the spending side, on the most serious component of government spending.
I'd love to dig into that, because I think this is a methodological choice that you guys made that some people will take issue with.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to play devil's advocate here, because again, like I'm not going to disagree with you in the broad picture, but I know that some people will say, look, you guys are not counting enough education spending because an immigrant, a 25-year-old, Latin American guy comes from Honduras or whatever, he has a kid here. And yes, that kid is a US citizen. They were born here. So because of that, in this analysis, you're not counting the spend that would be required to educate that kid as they go through school. But the argument would be like, well, that kid wouldn't exist here.
Yeah,
The spend was because of immigration. And so I guess just number one, it's a metaphysical question. But so number one, I'll make this a two-parter. Number one, why did you choose to approach it this way? Number two, if you did want to calculate it the other way, what would that look like?
Sure. So 2 points. Our main point is that deficits and debt are not the result of the immigrants, of the immigrant population, right? And so all this stuff about, immigrant welfare use and all that stuff, it's just totally mischaracterization of the budgetary situation. Immigrants themselves are lowering deficits and debt in the United States. And yes, some of the US born population are children or grandchildren of immigrants. We're all eventually here because of some immigrant. But the main point is, if you want to tackle deficits and debt in the United States, you have to tackle benefits for the US born population. You can't look at immigrants and say, that's the problem. So yeah, we absolutely, US born children of immigrants do increase the debt. Obviously, they have all the education spending and so on, brings down the benefits that immigrants provide. And for the second, or the final component of our report, it looks at the question of how much does the picture change when we do include all of the second generation, and not just their children, but the second generation who's a retiree now, whose grandparents came after World War II or something. Or her parents came. So that more holistic look at the situation, which it's valid. I mean, both, we don't deny that both pictures are valid. But what the primary message here is, you can't balance the budget or fix the deficit situation by tackling benefits for immigrants. You need to look at benefits for the U.S. born. Well,
That's not where the fat is there. That's not where you can cut the fat.
Yeah, I mean, you can always cut benefits. We could cut benefits even more severely for non-citizens than we already do, or restrict naturalization, so fewer non-citizens are entitled to benefits. We could do all those things. I support all of those things. It's not the issue. It's not the thing driving deficits and debt. It's all the other spending that we have. Even if we include the US born children of immigrants in the analysis, and there's no reason to stop there, we could include the grandchildren as well, if not for data limitations. But the bottom line is, even if we throw in the children of immigrants, you still see deficits and debt reduced over the last 30 years by about $8 trillion. So we start out with 14 and a half trillion in savings over 30 years.
I almost thought you were about to say 14 and a half children right there, which
Yeah,
I'm like,
14.
that is a big immigrant family, David. I don't know which family
Yeah.
you came from, but
14 and a half trillion children. So so I mean, even if we include the children, it doesn't erase the benefits. It certainly brings it down because of those costs. But in the even longer term, we look at, well, what is the trajectory that the immigrant children are on long term as well. And so if you look at that, look at their age profile and their income at a given age and at their level of education, and you can predict forward how likely it is that they're going to be either a cost or a benefit over the next 30 years. And over the next 30 years, they're going to be the most fiscally positive. So you can control for age, which we don't typically do. We're just looking at what's the real situation now, what happened in the last 30 years. But if you control for age and look forward, that second generation is going to be even more fiscally positive. So we would never want to wish them away and say, we're going to lose not just the immigrants' taxes and all of their economic contributions. You're also going to lose, going forward, the next generation, which is even more impactful in terms of net benefit to all levels of government than the first generation is. So we do look at it both ways. I think it's been kind of mischaracterized that we only look at it one way. We look at it both ways. But I think the more I don't know if both are valid, as I said, but I think the more pressing point here is that if you want to get the deficit under control, you have to look at spending on the U.S. born population. You can't just blame it on the immigrants.
I think that's a valuable point, and one that hopefully we can all. Hopefully, this report percolates through the policy environment. I'm skeptical of that, just given the world we live in right now, the environment we live in. But there was one really interesting thing that I thought you guys kind of concluded your report with some hypothetical scenarios of like, look, what would the U.S. debt situation look like without immigrants?
Yeah.
What, if we're saying that this has been a positive for the last, not just right now, but for the last however many years, the last few decades, well, what if we hadn't had immigrants over the last few decades? What would the debt picture look like right now? And what kind of, difference are they making in the U.S. fiscal debt crisis as we speak?
Yeah. So, I mean, without immigrants, you have the U.S. debt, all state, federal, state, local debt would be over 200% of GDP now, just from the immigrants' contributions since 1994. And so once you take that into account, some analysts believe that would be debt crisis material to be over 200% of GDP in terms of debt. So it is quite impactful, and the reason why it goes up more than just adding the 14.5 trillion in debt is because you're also cutting the size of the U.S. economy disproportionately, because immigrants are disproportionately contributing to the size of the U.S. economy. And this is actually, I should note, every figure in our report is understatement, because all of it excludes any knock-on effects in terms of economic productivity of the U.S. born population as a result of the immigrants' presence in the United States. And this is a well-documented reality of the economics of immigration is that when you have immigrants who come in, they increase productivity of the US born population. At the high end, it's because of their inventiveness, their ability to create new products that make us more productive. And at the low end, it's because they fill jobs that are less productive, allowing Americans to specialize in more productive, higher paying positions. You look at any restaurant, any construction site, you can see this complementarity taking place. And so, the Congressional Budget Office actually, in their report, has a model for this and say about a third of the effect of the illegal immigration over the last 4 years, the positive effect of that illegal immigration under President Biden was the result of these indirect effects on productivity. So it's a huge effect. We don't even try to, we just try to follow the tax payments as best we
Yeah.
can. We don't even try to quantify that. So all these numbers are kind of an understatement on the facts. The other way in which this is a real understatement is because we don't account for how much higher interest rates would be for the U.S. government if debt was at 200% of GDP. If it was at 200% of GDP, the cost of borrowing for the government would be much higher, and that would balloon the debt and deficit even more. So I feel like, hey, you look on Twitter, see all these people like criticizing, we're trying to inflate these numbers and all this stuff. And it's like, no, this is like the most conservative it could be. It's way worse than we're letting on here. And so, there's an irony in that. I
Yeah.
mean, you end up, you try to kind of be conservative and not go too far and making, a lot of it would take a lot of assumptions to kind of trace out the reason why you didn't is because it's hard to trace out exactly what specific people are causing the increase in productivity.
Yeah.
And it would be very difficult to do that on a kind of micro level, which we're trying to operate in and sort of break down who's causing the increases in tax revenue and so on. But the point is, I mean, this is a really understated effect, and it would be much worse if we ever got to that point where our debt was that high.
Yeah. If you took into account the ideas of economic growth, innovation, and like you said, the secondary effects that
Yeah.
immigrants can have,
Yeah, there's only one.
it would be a whole different picture,
Yeah.
and probably an even more positive picture. But I mean, I do appreciate the haters. The haters online, they keep you honest. They make you're in the back of your mind, you're thinking, I better be doing rigorous work because they will be going over it with a fine tooth comb. It's valuable to have haters in that sense, but um,
Absolutely.
we're coming up on time here soon, so I want to ask the traditional final question that I always ask on this podcast, and that is, where can people go to learn more if they're interested in what we've been talking about? First of all, we're going to put a link to the report in the episode notes of the show, so you can go. First of all, just go directly to David's work and click on it and read the report. But other than your own report, which is fantastic work, what else would you recommend for people who are interested in learning more about like actual scientific economic analysis of how immigrants impact things? They're interested in the fiscal picture. They're interested in how immigration works. What would you recommend for them to go read?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, like my colleague Alex Narasta is a preeminent scholar on all these matters. He's written extensively. He's written a book.
Also a friend of the show here. Yep,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So his book is called Wretched Refuse. And it basically goes through not just the economics. There's, kind of introduction that talks about the economic benefits of immigration, but also all the social and political and institutional arguments that you hear even more commonly now than the economics. I mean, now sort of the median response and reaction is, well, I don't even care about the economics. I'm happy to be poor if it means that, we don't end up having Spanish halftime shows or whatever other concern that they have about immigration. And so he kind of goes into more of that the political aspects. How is this going to affect our society there? So, I mean, big recommendation to that. The National Academy's report on the assimilation or integration of the immigrant population is sort of a canonical treatment. Goes into a lot of the, again, Spanish language or language acquisition, English language acquisition, and many other elements as well. To
I will also throw in there, Leah Bustan has done fantastic
absolutely, yeah,
work
yeah,
at Princeton, I believe. She's at Princeton Economist,
yeah,
and her specialty is basically the assimilation of immigrants. Historically, how well do immigrants?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Streets of Gold is her
Yeah.
book. Yeah, fantastic introduction and very long breath to her work and going over the last century. Yeah,
All right, I'm going to throw in one more recommendation. Again, not just check out David's report, which has come out recently from the Cato Institute, but David is also a fantastic follow on social media. He does a lot of speaking, and he comments not just about immigration and its impact on the fiscal picture, but also the criminology of immigrants. Are immigrants more criminal than most native born Americans? What's going on with ICE? He's got a lot of valuable commentary if that's something that you feel like keeping up with. He's been just a really good follow for me on the general immigration situation under Donald Trump's second term, which is a grim thing to follow sometimes. But I appreciate all the things that you're advocating for, David. All the work that you do. So everybody else should follow David. And I want to say thank you one more time for coming on the show, David Bier.
thanks for having me on.